Welcome to the Lost Signals Discusses Literature,
where we apply the revolutionary Mott skill
to classic and contemporary works of prose.
So, join us once again, won't you? Hello, and welcome to the Lost Signals Reviews Literature. 10 years from now, I will travel back in time to tell Robert Heinlein to title this work by his bootstraps.
10 years, he'd still be dead.
No, 10 years from now, I will go back in time.
Oh, I see. I got you.
And it's nice.
You're right. My bad.
I was inspired.
I ruined your joke.
So you are...
Wait, is he going to get pissed off and write the story the way he did anyway?
No, I'm not influencing how he wrote the story.
Just that he will.
Are you going to tell him that your name is Anson McDonald and that is why he's going to use that pseudonym?
Perhaps. In fact, you just inspired me to do that.
Yeah, well, now he's definitely going to do it, so the loop is complete.
I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Christopher Morgan.
Hi, and I want do something so we know it during this podcast. So have him put something in the story that's going to twig us to that you changed the timeline.
But no, the timeline is always this way.
But that's what I mean.
You're also with Stephen Ramosi.
Hello, I could never have said anything different.
And Scott Thurlow.
Well, I think I could have, but I probably won't.
So tonight we're reviewing the time travel story by His Bootstraps. Scott, you had the final logline for this?
Yeah, so I just went with a real Bob Wilson, please stand up.
Please stand up. Please stand up.
Please stop time traveling.
Please, sir.
That would have been better.
Yeah.
Can we go back?
I thought of that in the spot. Anyway.
We'll go back in time later to change that.
It'll be changed.
So I'm going to start with the plot. This guy is admitted asshole named Bob Wilson, who is a grad student writing a thesis on time travel, meets his future self, who helps him embark upon a closed time loop that of traveling to force himself to go into the future, become leader of
leader
utopia
of it
to his mind.
Yeah.
Right.
And then it's a fun story of just looping and trying to change the future, which is set in stone, or at least the premise of this work.
Mm-hmm.
I can probably go into more detail about what goes on in the story, but I'm more interested about what the story's about. And there's a lot of so I'm just going to mention two things and I'll pass it along.
Right.
One, I always funny about time travel is it's always temporal but rarely spatial. So if I went back to the start of this podcast and time travel, like in a direct line temporally, I'd be somewhere probably above the house.
in theory,
or
yes.
Maybe deep in the earth.
He'd be out in space somewhere, probably.
And that's what's kind of funny to me about time travel, is that it's always that you try, especially like the time machine and things like that. It's always that
informed power that it's always there. Yeah.
But also, I think that one of the really neat aspects of this is that is the closed loop, and that you can't change things. And there's a very famous part in this where his future leader self, named Dictor, gives the past self a book about how to translate the future's language. And he then rewrites it, finds out later that he is Dictor, and he goes, who wrote the first...
where did it come from?
Yeah. And there's a number of these paradoxes that develop in this. But I think for the most part, it's handled very interestingly.
So I'll say this. I mean, this is a very famous story within the genre. And in fact, Steve-O, you might have said this, but I'm going to say it first that, Bootstrap Paradox is named because of it, because it was one of the earlier ones that sort of set up that the loop that you just described, where each character basically is himself from different time periods, in quotes, and is enacting a self-propagating loop, essentially, of himself, by himself, and for himself, more or less. So, if we're going to, what I thought of the plot, I'm looking at a pretty solid 3. Like I read a lot of Heinlein, and I admit to you guys, this is one I didn't read previously. Like it just was a blind spot for me. But now having read it, I can see like why it was influential, why it still pretty much stands, at least I think. So I think it held together pretty well. Yes, introduces paradoxes, but that's sort of the point, which I think we'll get to in a second. But I'm looking at a pretty solid 3 for the plot. So what do you guys think?
So, I'll say this. I enjoyed reading this story. He introduces... I mean, this entire story is just one big paradox to me. Which... Perhaps the only reason that I know that it's a paradox is because Heinlein at some point wrote this story, and it's been much talked about, and
Yes.
like the bootstrap paradox has been much maligned since then. There's a movie called what the hell is it? The McConaughey time travel
I don't know what you're
space
talking about.
movie.
Interstellar?
I kept wanting to say intergalactic. That is, if you want to know what a bootstrap paradox
Yeah,
is,
true.
in a modern sense, go watch that movie. But it's a fun story to read. You cannot get too wrapped up in the
The
logic of what this time travel would actually entail. Otherwise, you'll just, go down this dark rabbit hole of like nonsense. But it's a really interesting story to read, and it brings up a lot of interesting philosophical points, right? Like, despite the fact that I don't think the logic of it is correct, there are a lot of philosophically interesting points that it brings up that do play regardless of the logic of the time travel. So I like it for that, in that sense. There are other certain points that maybe I'll bring up more in themes.
Or characters, but yeah.
Or characters that I'm not the biggest fan of, but I think that in terms of the story itself, I think it's good and enjoyable. I'm probably going to give it a 2. Not quite go to a 3, but I'm pretty close to a 3 on this.
Bob's Kampf. I really wanted to know. I was thinking about it because one of the books he asks for is Mein Kampf, but like when he goes to the portal, it gets cut in half, and I was wondering, like, did he put Mein Kampf in there just because it was a disposable book? Because he had a briefcase or something that he had in, so part of the briefcase was going to get cut in half, so I figured he'd have a disposable book. I found that was interesting based upon everything he put.
He also has Machiavelli in there, the prince.
Well-
and I think Machiavelli would approve of
Of his use of it.
destroying another book in order to make sure
Yeah.
his own book.
But Machiavelli would fit in well.
Machiavelli would also approve of
with
taking over an alien race, or like a
Yes.
future race.
It's the ultimate Machiavellian move.
Well,
Go on.
with Genevieve, his girlfriend, I mean, when he goes back in time, he's got some time to kill. So he basically goes
Literally.
in, proposes, sleeps with her, and then, because the beginning you get a phone call where he's kind of dismissive of this girl, like, hey, I wanted to talk about what we were talking about this afternoon. He's like, all right, I don't have time for this bullshit right now. I'll talk to you later. And then later on, when he's killing some time waiting for him to meet his other selves, he's like, well, I'll go to Genevieve's house and propose to her and sleep with her. So Machiavelli, and the way he treats the servant girls, women, at the part where one of them delivers food and he's like, oh, I want to hook up with her, and Dictor Rick basically says, here, we'll hook you up with her. And then the next one servant comes by and he's like, oh, goddamn, I wanted her instead. So definitely Machiavelli really fits in very well. I think I'm with Steve on this. I'm teetering between a 2 and a 3, and God damn it, because what would put me over to the 3 is kind of like knowing that this was one of the beginnings of the closed loop tropes. So I'm trying to decide, like, if I'm going to do the story or the fact that it was so
Or its
instrumental.
legacy.
Yeah, because if I'm going to include the legacy, it's definitely getting a 3. If I'm going in the story by itself, I figured it out right away. So
Yeah, but because he wrote the story, see, we keep coming out to that
See,
joke. So
There's actually a paradox involved.
there's a
in reading
paradox
this,
in my score right here.
sure.
Yeah, but it's already decided, so. Just say it.
I think this is an incredibly well-crafted work, although it doesn't... Like, just being able to see what is going to happen, the anticipation of events that you understand are going to unfold, and you get to see it from a different point of view, although the same point of view in a way.
The same but different.
I really enjoyed this work. And it's a fairly long work, and I was engaged throughout the entirety of it.
Yeah, that's good. That was going to be my kind of final argument as well to build on that. Like, yeah, I think it keeps you going. And yes, even though, as we all said, it's historically famous and it's still on the map of sci-fi fiction, but I still think it stands in that sense. It carries you throughout, even if you could predict it and like know what's going to happen. You still are along for the ride, I think, in a pretty good, solid way. So,
all right, this might be Machiavellian of me to say, but the details like that I found amusing in it, I'm going to give it a 3 because he was such an asshole, but yet by the same token that he had time to kill, so he decides to propose and sleep with this woman. I mean, it's
Wait,
like,
that's why you're giving it a 3?
No,
because he was an asshole to her.
No. What I'm saying
The only
is
reason he did that is because
he had time to kill.
Yeah,
But the other thing is,
and he thought it would help him like.
but it goes
with
part
his other
but
plan.
it goes part and parcel with the rest of the loop. I mean, so like being a dickhead and knowing Heinlein, it does kind of make sense.
That is to say that he had no other choice anyway.
No, he had a choice.
No, he didn't.
No,
that's not
this only works as a closed loop because he's an asshole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he's a drunk, because he's
Arrogant
self-serving.
dickhead.
And he's
Yeah.
self-deprecating too, because he openly admits that he knows shit all about like his doctorate, but he's only doing it because he wants to teach. But he knows he's a charlatan anyway. So yeah, I got to give it a 3. I mean, he's a complete dickhead, but you know,
well, that's a lot of characterization, but
sometimes you gotta give in to the dickhead. So
all right, I guess
What?
we'll end with that.
I guess Dictor really. I guess
What the
Dictor was
fuck are you
really
talking
a.
I don't know what he's
appropriate-
talking about either, but
So,
give
Steve-O,
give into the dictors.
Did his speech
No.
convince you? All right.
No,
Did-
I
did-
didn't
no,
think
Did
it was
Ian
going
and
to
I's more
convince him.
coherent
Now I'm
speech
giving it a 1.
convince you of anything?
Just kidding.
either?
No, I'm
All right.
going to stick with a 2.
All right,
It's
fair enough.
All right,
it's good.
just not
I
3
had
material for you.
initial
Yeah.
problems that contributed to what I felt about the plot, which are going to be talked about in other places as well.
I got you.
Okay.
What are you going to give it?
I give it a 3.
Okay.
I enjoy the hell out of this work. Anyway, Chris, talk about themes.
The themes, and I think Steve and I agree. The reason I call it Dictor of Rick's is because he kind of reminds me of Rick from Rick and Morty. And decidedly, I don't see. I mean, I don't really see any pluses with him. So I'm having a hard time with themes, except for like sometimes in a closed loop, being a dick works to your advantage. But then again, it's just like there's that whole thing where like to know thyself be true, but he doesn't know thyself, but he learns. So it's kind of a learning curve closed loop. I have no idea what the themes of this is. To be quite honest with you, I'm trying to figure it out, but to be honest with you, I have no fucking clue where to go with themes.
Which of you two is going to go first?
Scott seems to be.
Who would have gone first if I didn't open
I'll
my
just jump
goddamn
in
mouth?
real quickly. That like I see what you mean, I guess, on the surface, but I certainly think there are themes within it. Like you said, Steve-O, it raises a lot of philosophical questions, even if the logic of it somewhat falls apart. But you know, if time travel were possible, what would you do with it? Being who you are, like he basically sets himself to enslave the future human race, more or less, which maybe go in characterization, but that's his master plan, and he enacts it via like various versions of himself, convincing him and or coercing them somehow, you know, one way or another outright. So like, I just think it's interesting. Like maybe it's like who you are in the dark, given time travel technology as well, in a sense.
That can I address that quickly?
Sure.
I'm not sure, given the way that this story is set up, and given kind of a little bit of what I know about Heinlein himself, if like him enslaving that entire race was supposed to be like, I feel like it was supposed to be looked on as like,
A
oh,
positive thing.
this is your paradise now. Like this is what you have always deserved, or something like that. You know, like not necessarily that, but
Sure, no, I get what you mean.
like I think it was supposed to be a positive thing in
Yeah.
this book, and I looked at it as like, wow, that's fucked up. Like
Yeah, like
you just use your power of time travel to enslave the entire what's left of the human race.
remnants.
I mean, he
right?
started off as a dick and meeting himself over and over and over again, and with this power, he became even more of a dick.
Or the same dick he always was. Go on, E.
It's
No, but
interesting because you get to see different variations of the same person throughout, and in a sense, almost over the course of a day or two.
More or less, yeah.
But
Or
one,
30,000
he's drunk. The second instance, he's trying to he's like, "Oh, I'll just go back in time and rationalize with my former self. That's easy. No, that guy's drunk." Then he finds out new information, and he's in conflict with other versions of himself who have different information. And he, at one point, goes,
Wouldn't you agree I know more than you or something like that?
Yeah.
But it's watching someone struggle against their both fate and also their failure of themselves.
Yeah.
It's almost like watching inner monologue clash in dialogue.
Yeah,
and
that's a good point.
And I think again, this is famous for a reason, and I think thematically, even though you might not agree with Heinlein's politics in a way, but I think what he creates in this story is important.
I think that part is fascinating, and I really love that. I just thought of something, and I feel like it needs to be said.
Go.
Idiocracy is basically a direct descendant of this story,
Is that?
right?
Sure.
Luke Wilson is the smartest person on earth when he awakes in the future, and just that makes him immediately rise through all the ranks of government and everything, and become this
somewhat more benevolent.
Right.
ruler.
But it's a less nuanced idiocracy, I guess. In terms of that, in terms of what happens when he actually gets there, and I think that just dawned on me, and I think that's something that I really want to think about.
Is that going to give into as a one for themes?
Yeah, he's also, but he's not an evil. I don't consider him an evil ruler. Yeah, it's selfish, but he tries to bring culture. Then granted, all of it's self-serving.
Sure.
Granted, but I think he's looking out for, or at least to create a paradise that
From what's left.
that had been lost through time.
I get what you mean, but I don't see him trying to better the people that are under him necessarily. I see him just trying to live in this paradise and
Exploit them.
bang all the women that he can and eat all the good food that he can.
Introduces instruments, introduces fashion. He brings them music.
For his own benefit.
Yeah, it's self-serving, but the thing is, the way he describes it, at least, is that he thinks he would better these people by
doing
adding these.
so.
So again, I don't. You're right. He is self-serving in a lot of ways, but I don't think he's just an evil dictator.
And that's actually a good point. Perhaps knowingly or unknowingly, I'm not sure, but that is a discussion that he's having about colonizing underdeveloped countries and things like that.
Yeah,
I'm sure to some extent he meant to do that, but
sure.
I think to other extents, he's in this story trying to say oh, I am bringing them all the best things in life, and nothing that they have done since they've been born has ever been as good as what I am going to bring to these people.
So I just made a case for the benefits of colonization.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, that's what you just did, Ian.
Well, I'm not saying it was good, the colonization and so forth, but I'm saying there's strong enough themes throughout here, and a sense that's time, has something to say, makes you think at least, given what all just said. So I think there's a number of important and themes that are still relevant today for me to give it a 1. A pretty strong one, in fact.
This is definitely an archetype for Rick, but but it occurred to me when we were talking about music that one of the pieces he picks is Ravel's Bolero, which I hate because it's 10 minutes of the same theme. It's not even a theme and variation. It's just different instruments are picking up the dun dun dun. And the thing is,
I love Bolero.
Okay, but the thing is, this is.
What's that to do with themes?
No, but that's my whole point is he is basically going through this cycle where he is, it's the same hymn repeating with a slightly different voice, which is kind of like Bolero, which is picking up one theme.
Okay.
It's using the same theme. There's no variation on it. It's the same theme, just played by different instruments. So they're different variations of himself.
Well played, Chris.
Okay.
So you're giving it a 1?
I have to now.
Because of that.
I'm going to give it a 1 as well. Knowingly or unknowingly, on the themes that he brought up and the amount that I have thought about this story since I read it, I have to give themes a 1.
Okay.
Because it has actually sparked a lot of like interesting dialogue, or internal dialogue
Sure.
with myself.
Okay, this is an interesting one. Stephen, Antagonist.
Is Bob Wilson his own antagonist?
To a degree,
I would say
yes.
not really. I think he's trying to help himself at every point.
But is it
But he ends up-
antagonizing the protagonist?
He is to a small degree. Honestly, I don't think there.
Depends. Go on.
I don't think there's a strong antagonist in this. Maybe I'll be convinced otherwise. As I said to you guys before we started, I am able to be wildly swung on this story in a lot of categories, but I'm not sure that he's a good antagonist because he quickly realizes that the things that were antagonizing him, and this is the entire point of the story, is the things that were antagonizing him were actually spurring him on to be a greater person or whatever. So is he an antagonist to himself? Kind of briefly, until he realizes that he actually wasn't, and that's the entire point of it.
All right, I have two possible angles. One is Eldritch Abomination / Alien should not leave us time travel technology.
That's
because
for
that's
sure.
that, and then piggyback on that is time travel itself is somewhat the enemy, but that's also not quite true. So I do see what you mean, Steve-O. He both is and isn't. It's a weird one because of the nature of the story and again how it's set up. So
He is, because at each... So let's take the main Bob Wilson that we follow.
Bob Wilson
throughout
Prime,
this.
we'll say.
Sure.
He's antagonized by a different version of Bob Wilson at different points in this. And just as he realizes one Bob Wilson was correct or not a threat or no longer a player, another Bob Wilson appears to be an antagonist. And I think that's where it lies. And it's very interesting because it's not like... The fact is we're dealing with a whole bunch of different versions of the same person, all scattered throughout this apartment building over the course of a day. So
it's the room, but with time travel.
Maybe not a strong one, but a soft one, just because of the ambition of what they attempted to do here.
I think you convinced me on that just because I like the argument that yes, he's antagonist to himself, at each sort of timeline A by B, as versions of himself learn more information, they become less antagonistic, but then more antagonistic to the other versions and so forth. So I think certainly there's tension throughout with himself, essentially. So I think that might have been the argument that convinces me for a solid 1 on antagonist.
Yeah. So I will agree. I will concede or agree. I'm not sure which. That Bob Wilson is certainly his own antagonist. Do I think he's a good antagonist is another question. And I think that I'll give it a soft 1 for that. I think I can be swung to that argument. So I'll give it a 1 for that.
He's his own worst enemy. I'm giving it a 1.
All right.
It's like a lit song.
Sure. But with time travel, you can, anything you say in this story, you can just add on that little phrase and it'll work.
All right, Scott, on to Protagonist.
So sort of the opposite side of the coin of what we just said. You guys even laid it out. He's kind of a dickish, rude, arrogant asshole and stays as such to various degrees, antagonizing himself because he's listen to me, you stupid little asshole. I know more than you because I've been time traveling. So it sort of works both ways, I guess. That's the best evidence I have. Is he a good dude? No, not really.
That's not what we're asking.
Right.
Though.
But he's an effective, interesting protagonist. I think, maybe because of that fact, because he's not your Marty Stew kind of thing. He's got his flaws for sure. And certainly at least he eventually learns to use them in some way. So I think that might be my argument for a 1 on protagonist. Or protagonists, which are all him anyways.
So I love that he has to be kind of a jerk in this because what I always was considered what the story would be like with a very sober, rational individual.
Yeah. Oh, he's an alcoholic as well, so it seems. Don't throw that in there.
But I meant sober-minded, but it also works both ways.
Exactly.
And it because of you have that like that person is be able to have that conflict with other versions of himself, and at times not even know it.
Exactly.
Like he's an interesting train wreck of a dictator, of a future dictator.
Yeah.
He serves a role as protagonist, all of them, so I have to give him a 1. He's a dickhead, but I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I don't know if it would work if he wasn't a dickhead. And I don't know if he was intentionally written as a dickhead, but he
comes off as such. He's a dictator.
Well,
empirically, he's a dickhead, and empirically, all this.
We should have a running counter with how
many times we say dickhead because it's been a lot.
That's right.
To be fair, I will say this. I would agree with your argument, everybody's argument, that I think he is an effective protagonist, and I never really lost sight of this story. I never really lost interest in the story while it was going on, so I got to give him credit for that, or give Bob Wilson credit for that. But to be fair, for my earlier analogy to Idiocracy, I forget what his name is. Luke Wilson's character is like the nicest guy in the world. And it still works that way. Like I don't think that he needs to be a dickhead to make this work. He is a dickhead. Keep ticking.
He's a dictator head, is what I was going to say. But no, again.
But I don't think it needs to be that for the story to work.
No, that's a good
point. But I'm going to
give
give it a 1.
It doesn't have to be, but the fact that he is sort of works in his characterization certainly is true throughout, just to various degrees. So that's my final thought on that.
All right, I will go on to supporting characters. Bob Wilson, perhaps. But there's a couple of other people here. Genevieve, who is a Heinlein female.
Yeah, exactly. I'm waiting for one of you to say that.
And
terrible.
And even worse is the girl from the future one he meets.
Armor, whatever it is.
Yeah.
The lamppost from the future.
Yeah. Exactly. They're basically set dressing for sure. Go on, E.
So, non-Bob Wilson characters get a 0. But I don't know if, since we have protagonist and antagonist, I can give other versions of Bob Wilson as supporting, even though there are. Joe is definitely a supporting character to drunk Bob.
Right. You got Bob A, B,
Dictor
and
is a
C.
supporting character to Joe. So it's, I don't know, I'm willing to be convinced, but I'm not sold.
Okay. I think it's strange because, because everything we just said, that doesn't leave, should he fulfill all 3 of these roles, really in the story? He kind of does, but I think the way we cut it up between antag and protag doesn't leave any room for him to, fill that spot as supporting as well. I think it's 50-50, so therefore, maybe default 0 just because, the characterization of Genevieve was terrible, and as we just said, so, there's no other characters other than that. So I think it's, for me, I'm looking at a default 0 because of that.
Yeah.
Eldritch Monsters?
They weren't even there. They're just a glimpse of them.
He's the only character. Everything else is kind of a plot device.
Yeah.
It's
or
not,
set dressing or something.
Yeah.
Like window dressing, as Steve-O might like to say.
Are you done? I mean, I don't know. I think he does fill all 3 of these roles, right? I look at it. So if you take the story in terms of beginning, middle, end, we'll say. It's funny because a different version of him is a supporting character in each part of the story.
Yeah, I get you on that.
Right? Which I like a lot. I think that's one. I think supporting himself is one of the most interesting parts of the story as a whole. So, I'm gonna give this a 1 based solely on that. I like him having the 2 other characters come in the beginning and one is trying to stop him from going into the portal, and one is trying to get him to go in there, and then you find out why later, and you see him go through all these phases and have the other characters support him in the story, which and antagonize him in the story, which I don't know. I think that this little section, antag, protag, supporting, is the most fascinating part of the story because it's all him. Like this whole short story is all about the main character who fills every role. And I feel like Heinlein himself was almost like,
It's a pretty good trick.
I'm going to make one guy every character and see what happens and, see how it works. But, like, I'm going to give it a 1 for supporting.
You convinced me on that.
Yeah, I think, even though I thought I made a pretty good speech, I think you overtook me there, and I went back in time and convinced me. Because, like, I think, now that I think more about it as you were speaking, like, yeah, sort of a trifecta of, like, he's all of them, essentially. Yeah. Like, the other ones that weren't him are, like we said, basically set dressing, so they hardly even count as secondary, really, in retrospect. So, yeah, I think I'll switch to a 1 on secondary, because it's him at different times and different versions of himself, so good call.
I'm staying with a 0.
0, eh?
All right.
All right.
All right, Chris, dialogue.
Well, he's basically talking to himself for the whole story. I guess I, by default, have to give it a 1 because it is the dialogue, and
don't have to.
I don't know. It's weird because he literally is talking to himself the whole story.
Chris, I'm sorry to cut you off. Let me ask you this pointed question, and hopefully this will elicit a slightly different response from you than what you just said. Why do you have to give it a 1?
Because without his dialogue, there's an internal monologue, but there's a lot of dialogue that he has with himself. I mean, I kind of found it amusing. It's slightly amusing and annoying at the same time, but I don't know, the dialogue fills in a lot of the story, like internal and external, the dialogue, it fills in so much of the story that it doesn't need to be quotable. It is part of the narrative. So I can't really remove the dialogue from the narrative.
That is a much better answer than the first thing you said. Thank you.
Future self. So, like, yeah, I'll piggyback on that. I like how you said it's both amusing and annoying because it's a pretty good way to describe it. So, like, there are some of the lines where, like, when he says to himself, I knew better than you, like, which he does at that point, like, again, Joe A, or Bob B, if you will, like, knows better than Joe, etc. So, like, yeah, like, I like how he berates himself, like, from having gained future knowledge of what's going to happen. So, like, while it's not, like, the snappiest shit in the world, I still think it works. It certainly drives a lot of the action, So
what's fascinating to me, especially as a linguist, is the idea of context in conversation. In that you're following a character, like Bob Wilson, throughout this entire thing, interacting with other Bob Wilsons. But you get to see all points from a single conversation through the context of how they were developed.
Good point.
And it's really neat, and I don't remember reading much that does like this, like dealing with just, here's everything that led up to me saying this sentence. And then later on you get to find out why the other character
said whatever they said.
In response said that. So I have to give it a 1 for that.
And that's a solid point. And like it builds on what we just said, so I'm looking at a 1 as well.
I know what you mean. I think I'm going to give this a 0, though, because the dialogue itself wasn't great. I'm going to give style points for what you just mentioned, which is something that I was going to go into that as well. But for me, the dialogue's not great. It's
certainly fair. I can see what you mean.
It's 1940s classic, and it doesn't really rise above that. Like or 1930s classic.
41. 41. I'm sorry.
41.
But that era, and I've read a couple different things from around that era that I've liked a lot more dialogue-wise recently, which might take my score down a peg, but that being said, I think I'm going to give a 0 for dialogue, and I am going to give those points back in style for sure, because I do like the style of this.
I got you.
Speaking of style,
why don't you tell us about it?
Exactly.
A trope maker is this story.
Trope namer and codifier, all of them.
This story just did a lot for time travel, for science fiction, for just the way that we look at these kind of
concepts,
confusing stories, right? These stories that you don't really know what's going on until the end, stuff like that. Like, especially in terms of sci-fi. And I have to give it a ton of credit for that. It did a great job insofar as like making. I mean, the fact that there is, a paradox named after this story says a lot about the way that Heinlein was thinking about storytelling and the science of the time and things like that. So I'm definitely gonna give it a 1 for style. I'd love to hear what you guys say.
For me, for somebody who's been once again researching the dawn of science fiction, so as to speak, I kind of have to by default give style a 1 because this is like one of the quintessential stories, and aside from it setting aside, being the impetus for a lot of tropes, or in itself the bootstrap trope. I mean, this might be looking at it in hindsight, but I like the style of this era of science fiction writing. I can't put it any other description to say that I like the style of this writing. I always have, and I'm a complete sucker for it. So I am going to have to give it a 1 because this is what I like.
Yeah,
it may not be exquisite, but I like it.
Yeah, I don't know much more to add. I mean, like, Heinlein's style has always been pretty solid. I don't want to say dry, but it's clear cut. So, like, there's not a lot of fanciness to it, but it keeps you moving along very nicely. He knows how to use, again, like, I don't want to say simplistic, but a very stripped down kind of style, but it certainly keeps you invested throughout, and that's always, like, largely the case with almost all of his stuff, and I think there's no exception here. And like you guys said, the legacy of it and so forth still stands, but just on face value, I mean, he was a good writer, and for good reason, that's why he's remembered, so.
I have nothing more to add. I will give it a 1, though. All right, Scott, recommend.
Yeah, like you said, I'll go back in 10 years and recommend it to everybody. Like, yeah, it's funny because, as I mentioned, even though I'm quite a big fan, I just never got around to this one, or I believe I started it like a while back, but this is the first time I read it all the way through for this review. And yeah, you can see why it's just a classic and stands the test of time. Like, it's still referenced, like many works have, and still continue to like reference it or play on it in some way. So yeah, I absolutely would recommend it, even to non-sci-fi fans. Like, if you're not as hardcore into it, I still would recommend it. And of course, if you are, you probably have read it. And if you're like me, if just a blind spot, definitely check it out and fill in your gap there.
I recommended it for this episode, so I guess that gives a default 1 automatically.
Yep.
I don't know. We can always reference Turtle Dove.
Sure.
For the non-default.
I don't consider this a mistake.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Like Myth Manners? Is that a mistake?
That's
Okay.
that's what he was referencing.
Oh, is it? Okay, I'm sorry. I wasn't on that show. I did edit it though.
Mhm.
I'm definitely giving it a 1 because historically it's an important piece. Whether or not you like science fiction, because this has been used in so many different ways. So many aspects of it have been used, even if it wasn't a direct time travel closed loop story. I think it is important work. It may not have the finesse and nuance, but I think it is important, and I definitely recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, for that reason alone, I think because it's such an important work, and it's not by any means awful, I'm gonna have to recommend it. It's a longer short story, verging on like a novella. Almost.
It's like 40 pages, just to give you a reference.
It's important in terms of sci-fi. It's important in terms of literature, and it's just something that. I mean, it's not like your life is going to be incomplete if you don't read it, but if you're really trying to be a completionist and like learn what you can about the origins of time travel stories or sci-fi in general, or stuff like that, like the early days, this is a story that you should read, and it's definitely a page turner. It's good enough to keep you going, so I'm going to recommend it on those merits.
So I'm going to give the scores now.
What do we got?
All right. Scott and myself gave it a 10, which is slightly surprising for me.
Me too, but I was convinced on 1 or 2.
Chris, you gave it a 9.
Mm-hmm.
And Sivo gave it an 8, which gives a 9.25 overall.
That's probably about right. Like, that's probably what I would give it my personal scale.
Yeah,
I guess I did rate it perfect, but on our scale, it hit all the points. Or, again, you guys made some good speeches and good points that flipped me on a couple, so.
Well, I'm Jonathan Ian Menzer, and I have to go back in time to kill my grandfather. Here with Christopher Morgan.
Well, blah, 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 blah.
Super Mosi.
And I am Jonathan Ian Manzer's grandfather.
And I'll see you all in 30,000 years.
I can't unthink that.
Good night.
Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manser. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.